This episode was previously recorded and we're re-releasing it for your enjoyment. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello and welcome. This is Natasha Helfer. I'm so pleased to have Dr. Nicole Prause, who is a principal investigator for the Sexual Psychophysiology and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory, otherwise known as SPAN. She has her PhD from Indiana University with supervision from the Kinsey Institute for Sex, with her concentration in neuroscience and statistics. She was a research fellow at Harvard University dealing with alcoholism treatment, has worked at UCLA as an associate scientist, and now she's founded her own company where she can do independent research in Los Angeles and works as a data scientist. So I'm super excited to have you on to help us kind of navigate through a lot of the research and information that tends to be blasted out there on lots of media outlets and oftentimes can be misinterpreted or misinformation, even though there's supposed research to back it up. And this seems to be a problem, especially with pornography and the whole porn addiction model that has really become very popular, especially in what I call the Bible and Book of Mormon belts. So welcome to the program, Dr. Prause.
Well, thanks for having me on. This is definitely a group I would love to be able to talk more with.
Yeah, for sure. So tell us a bit about your history and background and how you came to study human sexuality to begin with.
Sure. This is unfortunately a really boring story, but I was just going to college, trying to get through like anyone, and needed some laboratory credits while I was at Indiana University, and the Kinsey Institute was offering them. And they have a laboratory that does psychophysiology research. So psychophysiology is just the joining of psychology and physiology. So you measure body responses and see how those map onto people's experiences, which is a really nice marriage of those two sciences. And just as soon as I took the class, I was hooked. It was a completely new way of looking at sexuality to me. The topic, of course, itself is very sexy to someone very young, but as I continued to go through graduate school, this area just has a lot of unanswered questions. There are a lot of barriers to getting science done in this area, and because of that, it is still a very wide open field that has a lot of things yet to be discovered. So it's also a very exciting area to be doing research.
So tell us then a little bit about how you came to decide to, in a sense, have your own laboratory and not be associated necessarily with a university.
Sure. So I was working at UCLA and got promoted to associate scientist. Everything seemed to be going really well there. I'd gotten a couple of grants, one from the federal government, one from a foundation, and one of them was to study the orgasm response. And anytime you want to conduct a study at a university, you have to go through an ethics board review process. And normally with sexuality studies, there are challenges. People always have questions about some things we might consider unusual. You know, they're very worried, for example, when we ask about sexual history sometime. That is, you know, are we going to be harming people by asking if they have a sexual abuse history, for example? And what was unusual in this case is they decided to decline the entire study on the basis that it included a component where we were going to have people reach orgasm in the laboratory. And they didn't have any human subjects concerns about it. There were no safety issues, no privacy issues. They really pointed nothing out. They just wanted that component removed. And that's extremely unusual. The chair said it was the second time he'd ever heard of it happening in the history of UCLA. And what that said to me was one of my grants was to study orgasm. So it meant I would not be able to conduct my future research at the school. And this is, of course, crazy. As a scientist, you have to be able to answer the questions using the best science possible. And, I tried to get help. Some of my science colleagues there tried to, reposition me to see if we could get on a different ethics board, if there's some way to kind of make that work. And ultimately just decided it was not a good place to be doing research that's very controversial. And that's when I decided to give business a try. So the current model, we took those grants both into my business, and we're funded for the next couple of years at least to do this kind of work and get it started.
That's amazing. And where do you get some of this funding from them? Is that government grants and things of that nature?
Sure, there are two main sources right now. One is from the National Institutes of Health, and specifically NIMH, National Institutes of Mental Health, funds a portion of it. That research is related to depression treatments. And the other portion is from a foundation. It's a nonprofit foundation that's interested in orgasmic meditation. So they want to learn more about that process, and we're studying it with them.
Okay. So help us understand, before we get into some of the more detailed research questions that I want to ask you, maybe some basic research principles that the lay public sometimes isn't always aware of. I remember this being kind of a class that was intimidating to me even in college. And so I'm obviously not a researcher, but it's interesting, I think, sometimes when studies are done, then how quickly there's correlation attributed to them. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit about some of the basic principles of good research, and then how we make informed decisions about what that research means.
Sure. I mean, I can think of three kind of science principles that come up a lot in research on adult films that I have seen. So certainly the one you mentioned, correlation is not causation. That is, just because two things are associated does not mean that one caused the other. To be able to demonstrate that, you either need an experiment or longitudinal research. Longitudinal means following them over time. And usually studies are just cross-sectional. That means you just ask them at one point in time, and you can't be sure what preceded the other to be able to attribute cause to porn, for example. The two other things see come up, one, a lot of people don't understand what we call Popperian falsification. What that means is testing a model like addiction or like sexual compulsivity. It's not a matter of the weight of the evidence. That is, it's not like if one gets more weight, it wins. Popperian falsification means of all the predictions of a model, if any of those predictions don't hold true, then the entire model is false. And so I see that error a lot where people are saying, it's, well, this study shows that, and so does this other one. And we say, yeah, but that doesn't matter because, 3 studies showed something different, so the whole model doesn't hold. And I've seen that's a problem. And then also controls. That is, people have a very simple idea that they're supposed to be like a placebo. They think about drug studies and that there must be a control group and that group must be separate from a test group, and that's the only way you can have a control. And that's definitely not true. That's called a between subjects control. The other major type is called a within subjects control. So sometimes we faced difficulties communicating that when we've had within subjects controls in our experiments. And people will say we don't have a control, and we think, well, of course we have a control. But there's some basic science literacy that has to be there to be able to communicate those things. And I think it's not something you necessarily expect the general public to have, but maybe this is a vehicle for getting those annoying kind of heavy research methods classes back into the public.
Right. So can you explain a little bit then what within controls look like versus the placebo controls?
Sure. So the basic distinction is a between subjects control versus a within subjects control. So between generally means you have people in different groups. So for example, if I wanted to do a between subjects control when I was testing orgasmic meditation, I might have some people who do orgasmic meditation and then other people who do mindfulness meditation. And then I would compare those two groups. Another way of doing it is within subject's control. And in that case, I could do something like pre-post measures, where I follow people who are doing orgasmic meditation, or they're put on a wait list, and so they don't start to engage in it until 2 months later. And then we can follow these people over time and see what happens when, if they're just waiting to start the meditation practice, or once they've actually engaged in it. And you can use that time variable to do the same thing you would for between subjects control, that is still make the attribution because you're following them over time. So that is one example of a way you could contrast a between subjects control, which is a more traditional placebo that most people know about from drug studies, versus a within subjects control.
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
And what particular studies have you been involved with that deal with pornography?
We've had many in this lab. My earliest work just used adult films to invoke sexual arousal, and we were mainly interested in studying the sexual response. So we weren't studying adult films per se, but we used them regularly. And generally, what people are sometimes surprised to hear in those studies is women respond very readily to sex films, even ones that we picked out for them that they didn't have control over, and that their tastes are pretty similar to men's. There are some distinctions, but the overwhelming trend is for those tastes to be similar. We've also had couples into the laboratory to view erotica together and apart and see what the different effects of those were. And this was actually in Idaho, so we had quite a large population of Latter-day Saints in that particular sample. And then, of course, we've done a lot of work since then on the neuroscience of viewing adult films, and we're continuing to do some of that work contrasting viewing adult films with actual sexual interaction.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about the results of the couples, especially together, study?
Sure. So we were interested in the couples study. This was a doctoral student of mine, Cameron Staley at Idaho State University, where in the past there had been a series of studies associated with the Meese Commission, which is very much a political document commissioned decades ago, that suggested a lot of negative effects of viewing erotica. These are things like women who viewed erotica felt that they were less satisfied with their bodies. And the assumption was that it was seeing these women who were very attractive and had huge breasts that made them dissatisfied with their own breasts or their own weight. And then showed some similar effects later on with men in terms of penile size satisfaction. So it had a lot to do with body dissatisfaction. And we were curious, whether some of the presumed effects on relationship satisfaction actually held when you looked within the same couple. So studies that were claiming there were negative effects on couples, often were just asking one person or the other. They weren't actually exposing them to erotica. They were just asking them in questionnaires. And, it's a much stronger approach to actually have them in. And so that's what Cameron did. He brought these couples into the laboratory, some of whom claimed to be adult film naive. That is, they don't watch it, or at least not regularly anymore. And we wanted to contrast a couple of theories to understand what the effects of these were on their relationship. So we had them view some erotica together and asked them how they felt about it before and afterwards. We also had them just view some exciting films to see if there was a difference in just viewing anything that got your heart rate up, to make sure it was something that was really unique to the erotica they were viewing.
Meaning non-sexual in content.
Right. So these were sports films. Idaho loves their downhill skiing.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a very common approach in neuroscience in general to contrast exciting erotica with exciting sports, because it controls for a lot of similar elements so that they really just differ on the sexual content, which allows us to more clearly attribute differences to the sexual content. And then we also had the couples view those films apart. and see if the responses differed. And it turns out them viewing together or apart actually didn't make as big of a difference as we thought it would. And we also found a number of effects that were in contrast to what had been reported in the Meese Commission previously. For example, when the couples viewed erotica and we said, how much would you like to have sex with your current partner, the guy or gal in the other room? And their ratings consistently went up. So, this is often something, of course, that adult film, people who think the adult films are negative throw out. They say, it diminishes your desire for a partner. And, that to us was direct evidence that the opposite was true. That is, it increased their desire in general. And if we asked specifically, how about that person in the other room? They said, yes, for that person. So, it's not that they're being redirected to some unrealistic idea that's being portrayed in the film. While they might respond to that and feel sexually aroused by that, they wanted to act on it. They preferred to do that with their partner. So,
interesting.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, that, if that's something, the potential extrapolation there is, if that's something a couple is doing, that if they're engaging in it with the knowledge of their other partner, that could be facilitating. If you have someone with lower desire, it may be helpful to watch erotica, and we often assume that it's going to be harmful, I think because of those old studies. But it really seems like our read of the data was that people are becoming more savvy consumers, that as we talk more about erotica and get to learn about it, people realize that that is fantasy material and that the function is for sexual arousal or masturbation, but that it is not something that's real. It's not a realistic portrayal of real sexual interactions, but something to get your motor going, so to speak, and that you can use that with your partner. And that there's, there are obviously some people that feel that's not moral or that that's bad, but that's a separate question. That's not really something science addresses. So from our perspective, at least, the drive then is made available, you could say, including for direction to your current sexual partner.
Which is really interesting, because I find that a lot of the issues that I work through with Mormon women who are very distressed when they find out that their husband has been looking at porn is this idea of it's threatening. It takes away from our relationship, right? It takes away from how he must feel about me, that the porn, in a sense, almost becomes another partner that is threatening and competitive with what she's able to provide. Whereas when I talk to the Mormon men, they're saying something very different. They're like, well, yeah, I like looking at it and it's exciting, but I totally love having sex with my wife. I want to have sex with my wife. It's not about not wanting to have sex with my wife. So it seems like that's, in a sense, what you're finding in this study as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of questionnaire research that supports that. Some of it's ours, some of it's from other laboratories. So, this was an experiment, which is a bit of a stronger design, but exactly, like if you ask people directly, why do you masturbate or why do you look at erotica, they will cite all kinds of what sound like very reasonable things. I was tired, I just wanted to help myself relax so I could go to bed. I didn't want to bother my partner. I feel sometimes like they should add some of the funnier things on there. My stomach was upset because I ate too much Mexican food and I didn't want to share that with my partner. I think sometimes those frank reasons are there, but it's, if we don't ask about them, we won't document them, and it's very rare in science for people to ask about the positive effects of erotica. It's very focused on the negativity. There are certainly exceptions to that, but overwhelmingly we search for bad things, and when that's all you look for, that's what you'll find. So I think there are people who are asking about both. We certainly ask about both positive and negative effects. In part, I think it's helpful to think about the function of masturbation and the function of orgasm. That is, it's not just for partnered connection. That is, it may be that someone's value system is that that's what it's for, and again, that's a separate issue from science. But from a scientific standpoint, people report using masturbation and erotica for all relaxation, de-stressing, distraction, all kinds of things that, exactly like you see clinically, seem really independent of the relationship and can be preserving, if they don't want to put up on their lower desire partner, for example. They may see it as something that's nice to do, to not burden my partner with my desires, that I'm just going to take care of this myself. Whereas their partner does not see it that way. So the communication becomes very important.
Right, which is more about sexual contracting versus whether or not it's harmful scientifically. Yeah. So is it true that you see your own studies used in very inaccurate ways as you see the reports coming out on news type of venues, newspapers, articles, television shows, etc.?
I've seen our science represented in a number of different ways, and the journalists that reach out to us tend to do a bit better in terms of their accuracy, because we can explain whatever questions they have, kind of clarify things before they go out, which is helpful. But there are good studies that have been done on kind of the representation of science in the media, and unfortunately, the overwhelming amount of media are actually anti-science. And there have been a few studies of this now showing that scientists are just busy. We don't spend as much time working with media, talking to the public, as someone who only blogs or is focused on podcasts, or doesn't, that this is really their full-time focus. But even if they're pushing a particular agenda, they have a lot more time to spread that, and can set up multiple websites to do that. And that's generally what we see with our work. Is there are some people who have very strong agendas, who have published information. Sometimes it's been so egregious we've actually had to send out a number of cease and desist letters because, for example, they were publishing for a period that we were funded by pornography organizations. I've never received any funding, and am not currently receiving any funding from pornography. But they try and evoke conspiracy theories and claim that things have been debunked when no neuroscientist feels that way. It's just their group. But because they have an overwhelming voice just in terms of the volume of stuff that's present online, it can be very difficult to counteract. When I got a full-time job, I have other things that we're focused on and trying to advance. So it's yes, there's a lot of misinformation about our research out there, and there are very frequent and overwhelming voices at times because we just don't have the kind of time they do to counteract some of the misinformation.
Right. Okay, so I'd like to go through a list of things that seem to come up a lot as far as some of the complaints against pornography and erotica. So is it okay if I just kind of go down that and you tell me what you know about it as far as the research that's out there?
Sure.
Okay, so the first one is kind of this idea that the brain lights up, that when you're looking at pornography, that you're, in a sense, accessing the same types of reward systems that drugs would access, and therefore you could very well fall into this addiction type cycle with pornography as you would a chemical substance.
It is the case that viewing erotica and also engaging in manual genital stimulation activates some of the same brain areas that are involved in rewards. Rewards include cocaine, they include gambling, they include sex, they also include images of puppies, they also include images of chocolate. So it's a piece of the puzzle, and I would say a necessary but not sufficient condition. So again, it's back to that Popperian falsification issue. That is, sex and erotica, absolutely. They activate those areas that are associated with reward. They also increase the activity of D2 and D3. Those are dopamine receptors when we do positron emission tomography studies. They look similar in that sense, but these are consistent to all rewards. So the idea that these areas are activated, yes, it's necessary to even consider them as an addiction in the first place, that be happening, but it's not a sufficient argument. So absolutely, our lab has actually shown some of that. We've published some of that work ourselves. So absolutely, sex and erotica viewing look like rewards, like a lot of other rewards.
Just because something is rewarding doesn't automatically put it into the addiction category, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I'm going to just tangent a little because I noticed that you're using erotica much more than you're using the word pornography. So can you maybe explain why that's your choice and preference?
Sure. If you read scientific studies, usually you'll see one of two terms for people that are trying to keep neutral. So you'll either see VSS, which stands for visual sexual stimuli, or you'll see SEM, which stands for sexually explicit media, sometimes referred to erotica. But what struck me is there's now a new trend by all the new scientists who are starting to come into work in sexuality to call it pornography. And that language is biased. It's not appropriate in science. And we're going to continue to fight its use because it very clearly has a negative historical connotation. That is, to use that word is to assume that the effects are negative. It's saying outright that I have this assumption that anything that involves nudity and people interacting is going to have a negative effect on you, therefore I'm studying the effects of porn. And I hate that because it's, these are scientists who are being inaccurate, poor in their use of language, poor constructs. But it's very difficult because a lot of the work that's being done is not by people who have a background in sexuality, and I think they don't realize the weight of their language and what it is they're asserting by using those words. So yes, we try and keep it more neutral with SEM or VSS. Sometimes you use erotica. Some people complain that erotica has a positive connotation and that that's not an appropriate use. So in papers, usually it'll be VSS or SEM.
I will refer to erotica as well from here. Because you're right, when you look at the definitions of pornography, there are negative connotations within those definitions. So thank you. So the next one I see a lot, and it kind of goes along with the first one of the addiction model, is that if you start looking at pornography, you're going to somehow lose control over your ability to watch these materials. And so then there's this sense of I'm out of control. I don't have control over my behavior. In essence, similar to chemical dependence, where all of a sudden now there's either withdrawal or tolerance or those types of issues.
Sure. There are a few pieces in that you just mentioned. So that out of control issue is somewhat hard to study because if you ask people directly, there are many studies where people report feeling out of control in their use of erotica. Many people obviously report feeling that their use of erotica is out of control. There is no doubt that if you ask patients, people who have come to treatment for that type of thing, that's generally why they're there, as they feel that they're not able to regulate that. But there have been 2 independent laboratories now that have investigated at least a part of that question. And one was Jason Winters, who brought in men and looked at their erectile responses while they were viewing erotica, including some guys who felt that they were unable to control their responses. And it turns out, when he instructed them to try to alter their responses, they were actually better at regulating their sexual arousal than guys who did not report having those problems, which was unexpected. So we attempted to replicate that study. So a separate sample, we included women, we broadened it out in some other ways as well, and we found the same pattern he did. That is, people who reported having problems regulating their viewing actually had better control over their sexual arousal. No one has published anything to the contrary so far that we've seen, and so this is one case of, now we've seen several, where people report having a difficulty, but when it's actually brought into the laboratory and we try and establish it, we can't find evidence for it. So I'm not sure exactly where those reports are coming from, what's generating them. There has been a series of studies now by Joshua Grubbs and some other folks, and we may talk more about them in a minute, but finding some of the strongest associations for people reporting feeling addicted to erotica or feeling that they are out of control are conservative values, a stronger belief in a deity, and these types of things. So it's suggestive that some of the distress people are reporting, possibly also in respect to this feeling out of control, is really that they're not out of control, but that they feel they shouldn't be viewing this at all. And so their behaviors are just conflicting with their values, and that may be what's generating those reports of distress and feeling out of control. But that's I think, yet to be established in a more firm way, but there are good reasons to suspect that might be the case.
Yeah, that's very interesting and very much mirrors what I see in my practice, as far as people coming in and feeling a huge amount of distress, feeling very upset about their behavior to the point that there can be clinical implications such as depression, anxiety, or maybe those are also there prior, right? So chicken and egg type of issue. It's exactly that there is zero tolerance for any erotic viewing in our Mormon culture, quite frankly. And so that's a very hard standard to meet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a series of studies now suggesting, too, that people that are more distressed by their use don't actually use any more than people who are not distressed by their use, which raises the question, why on earth is that? In every other case, like if you're talking about cocaine, the people who are distressed by their cocaine use actually use cocaine.
Right.
The people who are not don't. So it doesn't mimic a lot of substance use research. It doesn't mimic any other behavioral addictions. It really seems unique in that way. Normally, if we're talking about a use problem, you have to use. And that just seems completely different. And I don't know right now if it's a subtype issue. So maybe there are some people who have very high use, and we just need to separate them out from the folks who are more just conflicted with their values. But we don't have those outlined yet. I definitely don't know how to subtype them well. And I think that's, there are a couple of groups that are looking into that type of a question, but we don't have that established.
Okay, great. You kind of mentioned this already, maybe a little bit, but this idea that watching erotica is going to cause erectile dysfunction.
One thing I'd like to point out is to think about going to the movies. If you're going to see the latest Batman or whatever it is that comes out, you go with family, you get popcorn, you're in a theater, that's the experience of watching one of these feature films. Pornography is not a film. You do not bring popcorn. You don't ask if your friends want to come. Pornography is for masturbation, period. So what's really funny to me is a lot of these discussions about, what are the effects of erotica, of sex films, is we pretend like people aren't masturbating to them. So there's kind of two pieces to the erectile dysfunction question. There's been 4 direct studies of that. 3 of the studies found no relationship between the amount of erotica people view and erectile functioning. One of those studies, our study, actually had an experimental piece where we brought people into the lab, showed them erotica, and we actually see people that view more erotica at home report feeling more sexually aroused to erotica, so exactly the opposite of what you would expect for that. And there's one study that came out last month that reported a very weak relationship, that is, between viewing erotica at home and erectile functioning with a partner. So that's the first time we've actually seen some consistency between the two. Not clear why that sample was different, other than that they recruited from some of these shaming websites that insist porn-induced erectile dysfunction exists. So it could be a volunteer bias. That's my guess at this point, since it's the only one that's found that. But we'll see over time if that bears out. And so I think the main thing we need to be addressing with this is really thinking about the relationship between masturbation and erectile functioning, which, if we pretend like those two aren't related, then we'll blame it on the erotica. But the fact is, you're masturbating every time you watch erotica. And I think we need some way of separating out, does this really have anything to do with, sex films per se, or is it just the behavior that comes with them? And I think it's immensely more parsimonious, more likely, that it has to do with your masturbation patterns and erectile difficulties to the extent those exist. So I would love to see future research start to ask about those separately. I think it's a bit silly that we haven't already, that we're pretending like masturbation doesn't always accompany erotica viewing. It almost always does. And we need to separate those out more clearly.
Okay. And maybe along with this then is this idea that those who watch erotica would lose interest in having sex with a real partner.
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely a fear. And the truth is, on the one hand, yes, like if you watch erotica and you masturbate and, your partner gets home 5 minutes later, yes, like you just had this experience, and your drive is probably going to be less than it was had you not done that just before they came home. But the idea that we're going to pathologize that and try and say, it's a sexual dysfunction. Of course it's not. Like, that's just bad timing. It's you can plan a little better and maybe coordinate things, but these things happen. And in part, I think people are getting very distressed about some things that are, a normal part of life and functioning, and with better communication would not be so much of an issue. So I would love to see more talk around that, just trying to make sure that, if your partner is using erotica, that you have some discussion about what is comfortable use, that if your lower desire partner is coming home and they're actually feeling desirous that day, maybe you should let your partner know so that they don't accidentally short circuit the possibility of having intercourse. Maybe they're trying to do you a favor, that is by taking care of things themselves, and you need to let them know that actually today would be a good day, honey. Don't go without me. Oh, okay, I'll wait. Those types of communications could be so helpful, and we need to stop being bashful about them. And I think just talking about them can help alleviate some of that perceived connection between the erotica use and functioning with the partner.
So there's nothing to really support the idea that once somebody is masturbating to erotica, and they're going to continue to do that more and more and more, and to the point that they really prefer that over being with a partner.
There's no evidence that it shifts that direction. I think there's a long history of relating erectile dysfunction to people who have higher anxiety. So, if you're someone who generally has an anxiety problem and you're anxious about dating, for example, then I could absolutely see you saying, well, I'm a lot less nervous watching porn. I like watching adult films. It makes me less anxious. And when I'm with a partner, it makes me very nervous that things aren't going to work. Well, that's traditional ED. That has nothing to do with the porn. So, I want to be fair and not say, it's not that there's no connection, but my expectation is, to the extent people are watching more erotica and feeling like there's some connection, that there's a lot of history of just people who have high anxiety. So if you're using erotica because you're a very anxious person, it's not the erotica, it's your anxiety. You should work on the anxiety piece.
What about this maybe more tolerance issue, in the sense that, if you start looking at certain types of erotica that maybe are considered more mild or vanilla, that after a while that's not going to be sufficient to get you aroused, and therefore you need more intensity or different types of erotica or harder types, and even concerns all the way going to then even criminal types, like things that would include things like child pornography, or that idea that it's just going to escalate until there's no return.
Sure. There's been one study that looked at interest in different types of erotica over time, and they do find, for example, that people will become more likely to view BDSM, that is bondage, domination, sadism, I have to think my way through BDSM, to those stimuli over time. So there is some evidence that people's interests will branch out. And I think the question is exactly, so what? What is the effect of that? Is that something we need to be concerned about? Is that tolerance or just interest? In the same way, if you like running the 5,000 meters and you love 5Ks, at some point, you'll probably start thinking, should I try a 10K? And what is the difference between interest and tolerance? So if this is a hobby or a habit and something you enjoy doing, we need to demonstrate that there's some negative outcome that's associated to really demonstrate a tolerance effect, and that we have not seen. As far as the links with erotica and illegal viewing, a number of people have cited the idea that people, when they get caught for molesting a child or for interacting sexually with a child in some way, that it was caused by erotica, because they often report that they view erotica, either adult erotica or child pornography, And there's actually never been a demonstration of a connection between those two. That is, there's nothing about viewing those images that causes someone to offend against a child. And those data are very clear. So I don't see that. I don't see the risk in terms of tolerance as branching out to abuse. There's no evidence for that it's going to cause someone who would not have otherwise abused children to suddenly do that. And then there's, I guess, the other piece with intolerance there, like, are you going to stop responding to a partner because you need something so intense that it's exceeded a partner? The main research we need in that area is showing whether or not there's a difference between sexual stimulation from visual stimulation alone from the films and from sexual stimulation with a partner. And currently, sexual stimulation with a partner looks very different than with a film. So it's very difficult for me to swallow the idea that your partner offers nothing different in terms of sexual stimulation than a film does. You know, on the face of it, it just has no face validity. But we have far less research about that because, as I mentioned at the start of this, it's very difficult to conduct research on partnered sexual stimulation in the U.S. It hasn't been done since Masters and Johnson. It's even very rare in Europe. So we're starting to do some more of that work to see what the differences are. We assume that they're probably there because there's so much more that goes into partnered interaction than with sex films. So there's just no way, no matter what you're looking at with sex films, I think that that's ever going to be able to replace the unique stimulation that's available with a partner. But at this point, that's more speculative. We don't have good data on that last piece.
Okay. And since you went down to the illegal types of issues, what about this idea that pornography is vastly violent? So in other words, what's made the difference between violence and BDSM?
Usually people draw the distinction between violence and BDSM as to whether the person who is receiving the violence is portrayed as enjoying it or not. That is, someone who's portrayed as enjoying it, they call that BDSM. On the other end of it, I think it's important to note when people have done systematic, that is, random draws from internet erotica, so that is, they pull off sites in some way that's not biased. You know, they don't go to sites that are advertising violence, but more just general tube sites. And they have quantified the amount of violence that's portrayed against men and women, and then what they call objectification. And so objectification is this idea of using the other partner for your sexual pleasure without regard for their preferences. And it turns out in erotica, violence is enacted against men just as often as it is against women. So the idea that erotica is more violent against women does not hold. However, the objectification is more clearly high against women. So that is, it's much more common for women to be portrayed as a sex object, that is something men are using for their sexual pleasure without consideration for the women's pleasure. But the violence piece is not true. That is, violence goes just as often against men as it does against women.
Can you explain a little bit more about the female objectification piece? Because this is one of the probably most often cited criticisms about erotica viewing, is that it gives women a bad message. It uses women in inappropriate ways, that even the industry uses women in unethical ways. Can you speak to any of those issues?
So I've never seen any data where they actually ask the women in those particular scenes how they felt in a systematic way. You know, certainly some of the films themselves kind of do debriefings and try and portray that the women were okay, they liked it, you know, trust us, but those aren't systematic, that's not science. So it is the case, absolutely. I think we have good data to show now that women are objectified more in sex films. And the question is, what is the impact of that? So, for example, one of the negative effects that's often cited in the violence that is portrayed is people who are already showing some tendencies towards sexual assault. If they view images of violence and sexual assault, become more likely to report that they're going to have an interest in those behaviors themselves. That, of course, is concerning. But what we also know from those data are, if we sit people down who don't have that tendency to begin with, so if I make the assumption that you are not a rapist, and I sit you down and I show you just tons of men being aggressed against, or show you objectification perhaps of men instead, that if you're not already tending that way, porn is not going to magically turn you into that. And so I think the data we have so far suggests that the objectification is most likely to be something that's a concern for people who already kind of have that negative behavior, aren't treating their partners very well, that it might reinforce that behavior. They may want to do it more often. So that's my biggest concern with the objectification. But I am not concerned that, if this is a guy or gal who generally has solid values in that area and is considerate of their partner, that watching this stuff, I think, is unlikely to suddenly change who they are and make them a different person. We don't see that in the violence literature, and we just don't have the data on it yet for the objectification.
And along with that, then, isn't there also data to support that in countries where erotica is allowed and legal to watch, that actually sexual violence decreases? And is there even a correlation between those two things?
Oh, sure. So stepping out a piece, it's interesting, actually. The more erotica that people view, the more egalitarian their values are, which seems antithetical to kind of every claim of evil people are putting on the effects of erotica. But I thought at first that was probably a causality issue, that it was probably just people who are more educated have more access to internet erotica, but then a follow-up study showed that wasn't the case. It's not just due to education differences or those things I would have assumed. I have no idea, though, why watching erotica would cause you to have more egalitarian values. So I'm not sure why that's the case, but we have several studies now showing that to be the association. And then the piece you mentioned, that is, some people have investigated a discharge hypothesis. So the idea that someone who has violent tendencies, if they view erotica, that may allow them to masturbate instead of feeling like they need to aggress against someone to take out their sexual drive. And that does seem to be the case. That is, if you look at what we call natural experiments, that is when erotica is made available or made less available in different areas of the world, that the sexual assault rates tend to follow. That is, as erotica becomes more available or is available in different countries, that they have lower reports of sexual assault in those areas and countries. So that discharge idea seems to be the case. Some of these studies are just associative, so it's difficult to know if it's just, the countries in general are becoming more egalitarian, are becoming higher socioeconomic, and then both of those things may co-vary just by chance. But some of the studies following this longitudinally over time make a bit of a stronger claim that is really when erotica varies, even within a particular area, that the sexual violence follows, and that there's some argument to be made for it being used as a discharge.
Along with the violence theme, is there anything to talk about the possibility of sex trafficking? For example, I spoke with a sex trafficking advocate, and she seemed to imply that young girls, young teenagers who are susceptible to being taken into the sex trafficking world often have a history of pornography being shown to them by father figures. In other words, inappropriate sexual jokes or access to erotica that comes across in this very crass, kind of diminishing way of viewing women. Do you have any idea of those types of studies?
It's getting outside of my area of research, so I know that there is a lot of interest in the sex worker community of trying to understand where some of those ideas come from, because it's very difficult to test them if, for example, people just make claims that either the erotica itself is trafficking. I've seen that argument, or that most of those women are trafficked. Those kinds of claims. It's difficult to know where to even start to test something like that, because the claims are very easy to shift. If you say, well, we went into this place and they had great consent forms and the women didn't report being depressed and they were, getting their health screenings appropriately, that then the other side could just say, well, you're at the wrong place. That place is the exception. So one of the things that strikes me as is a long-time critique of, for instance, some Freudian psychology is we used to say they don't make falsifiable predictions. So Freud was notorious for, making claims about the nature of your psychosis, but then if it turns out their framework didn't fit, they'd say, oh, yeah, well, it's not that, it's actually this other, it's the reaction formation, or it's this other thing. So they would make predictions about behavior that weren't specific, to where they could kind of shift around and everything, they could make anything fit their theory. And that's what I'm a bit concerned is happening around on the other side right now. That is, I'm not totally sure what it is they would want us to test that would either support or falsify their position. And so I would love to see a little more specificity, because obviously that's something I think even the industry folks, to the limited extent I've talked to them, they don't want that in their industry either. They don't want to be supporting that. They have no reason to do something like that. There are plenty of folks who want to do this. That's actually a bigger problem they're having. I know their profits have tanked recently, despite reports to the contrary, because so many people are interested in, becoming a starlet or trying to break in, that their profits are actually quite a bit low. I don't know to what extent.
You mean for the sex workers themselves, or for the companies?
For both, mm-hmm. Yeah. That the payments for the performers have decreased, the payments for the businesses have decreased, and it's because all of this has become so available. There are lots of amateur sites where people post this stuff for free for others to see. So it's very difficult, I think, for that. I'm not trying to carry special sympathy. I think it's just that my impression is it's the trend in their business. And so they really have no reason to try and pursue folks who don't want to be involved in it, and I think would actively try and work against that. They don't want to go down that road any more than I think people want to see women go down that road. They want people who want to be there, who are consenting to be there, and I think part of the challenge is exactly that screening process, and I think they'd benefit tremendously, if the roles were more proactive, and let's find out how we can help you better screen for that. Not, we hate your industry and let's shut it down, because they won't. It'll never be shut down. And I think their goals are actually very similar, in wanting to keep that problem, that challenge out of their industry, and reduce it in general to the extent they can help. I think it's really, they're not at the loggerheads they think they are, and I wish they would collaborate more in that area.
So back to relationships, another concern I often hear is that erotic viewing would, interfere with the bonding connection of the couple. And I know you talked a little about the Idaho study. It was interesting because I was just at a sex therapy conference making updates on Facebook about some of the research that was being presented, and you quickly chimed in and was like, what's going on here? What research are you citing? And I was like, oh, the oxytocin bonding hormone. And you're like, I'm not so sure about that. So it'd be interesting to hear your perspective about how some of this, again, this research is used about how we have bonding, oxytocin, the role of oxytocin, and whether or not erotic viewing interferes with the ability to bond as a couple.
So the funny thing about all of this oxytocin talk is we know very little about sex and oxytocin. So again, the concern, I think, is when people are watching erotica, they're masturbating. They are having orgasms, generally speaking. The erotica itself, we have no reason to think gives you a strong oxytocin response as compared to the orgasm specifically. And we've never had a study that directly contrasted viewing erotica and partnered stimulation to orgasm. So, in some sense, we can't make those statements. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest one way or the other, that there's more or less oxytocin in one situation or another. Also, the simplification of oxytocin to a bonding hormone is vastly overstated. Oxytocin tends to co-occur with a number of other neurochemicals. Vasopressin is a very common partner chemical that does something very different. Our understanding of these relatively complex or potentially complex interactions is in its infancy. I think we know very, very little, and either side, can't make those claims very clearly. So the idea that you're going to somehow bond with your computer, I say, well, then you're also bonding with your hand. It's because what you're actually talking about is orgasm because you're masturbating. And if you think you can condition to a film, well, you could also condition to your own hand, potentially. And there are a lot of questions in there, that we don't know very much at all, I would say, about, what the bonding potential is between one and the other. So we really need those studies contrasting within the same person, them viewing erotica, them masturbating with or without erotica, and them being sexual with a partner to the level of orgasm. And because of some of the constraints we've had on being able to do that work, we just don't have the data. So it's potential that you might also have some sensitive feelings while viewing erotica. I'm not sure exactly how people think that happens. Is the possibility there? Sure. But I don't see any reason why that's a zero-sum game, why it then goes to the films and not to your partner, or it goes to your hand and not to your partner. There's just so much there that I really can't speak to, and we need to be able to answer those questions. That we need to untie scientists' hands so that we can actually look at it and answer some of these in a more informed way. But that's my guess.
So let's move a little bit, as much as we can, into research that has to do with the possibility that either sex addiction language plays or even religious values plays. I know you said there's probably not a lot in that department, but I thought I've heard something around the idea that if you're using sex addiction language or even sex addiction treatment, that there's possibly some harm more than good as far as, again, the narrative and how the issue is being perceived and how it tends to attract people maybe with higher religious values than those who aren't. So to some of your points from before, that there might be even less behavior but higher distress.
Sure, it's this is a good time to talk because there was just a special issue that came out with the series. It was like 7 or 8 studies just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, looking more at these issues. So the initial study was by Joshua Grubbs and colleagues, where they looked at people who adopted this, specifically the addiction label, so people who felt that they were sexually addicted, and followed them over time. So again, following them over time as a within subjects control and one way to establish causality. And what they found is that people who adopted that label actually reported more distress with their over time, but their viewing level was no different than people who did not use that label. So what that told them was something about people or the label and the use of that was causing harm, was causing them to be more distressed over time than their actual behavior suggested. And they've done a series of follow-up studies trying to understand what that effect's about. And many of these are just cross-sectional, but they've shown things like the more you believe in a higher power, regardless of what that is, the more likely you are to use the label sex addiction. The more conservative your home is, that is not necessarily religious per se, but just conservative values, the more likely you are to use an addiction label. And what these are really suggesting is that people who feel that they're addicted or that word is really more consistent with just general socially conservative values, that it doesn't really have any scientific value, that people who insist that it's so important to use it, it's much more likely to reflect something about who they are and what their values are, which is fine. I mean, everyone should have values and what they think is important to act on or not, but that's not science. It's just because you really, really, really believe in the word does not mean that the addiction model is true or is accurate. And so we're trying to, I think that's part of our work as scientists, is trying to divorce those two issues and saying, if you have problems that are really at conflict with your value, that's fine. You are worthy of help in trying to change the behavior in a way that's consistent with your values. But that the scientific issues in labeling those as an addiction or understanding the model, that's a separate issue, and that those really do not hold up.
Yeah, it was really interesting as I saw your interview on Salt Lake Tribune that there was you and a professor kind of on this idea that maybe we shouldn't be calling pornography a health crisis in Utah. And there were two therapists that I believe were associated with Lifestar that were very much, very tied to the sex addiction model. And they kept on coming back with this, well, regardless of what the research says, regardless of what the science says, we see the distress. We see the distress that people are coming in with. And what I found so fascinating is that we never really addressed where's the distress coming from? Is the distress coming from really pornography viewing, or is the distress coming from exactly what you're talking about, which is this conflict between their values and their behavior, which I tend to think that's where it's coming from versus the behavior itself necessarily. So I just thought that was really fascinating, and no ability to really kind of separate those two ideas.
Yeah, I've seen the Lifestart treatment materials and another set of treatment materials as well, and what really worries me about the tie to the addiction model is one of those, I won't say which, claimed that sex was 64 times as addictive as cocaine. That is not possible. It's false. There's no way, there's no neuroscientist on the planet that would endorse that. I feel very confident saying that. The material is providing false information, and it's to support their addiction model. And that's the kind of thing that really worries me about people using the addiction term, because I have no problem with you seeking treatment, seeking help to reduce a behavior that you want to engage in less. But trying to scare people with false information, that's bad. They shouldn't be doing that. That's not fair to patients. That's not accurate. And that is what worries me about people who are really tying themselves to that model, because I think they feel the need to prove it. I just divorce yourself from the model. You don't need to prove it then. People can still be worthy of help without having an addiction. And exactly, I think we need to divorce these two conversations to just understanding, it's the same thing with television viewing. There are actually a number of very good treatments to reduce television viewing, because many people, especially children, but adults as well, feel they view too much television. We have great ways of helping you reduce your television viewing, and we don't call it an addiction. And I just really wish we could move to that type of a model of saying, you have a behavior you want to change, great. We have something we can help you do that with. We don't need to call it an addiction. We don't need to go into an abstinence program or pay for these, multi-$1,000 inpatient treatments. We can actually help you just as you are and focus on the behavior that's worrying you for whatever reason.
I'm associated with the Mormon Mental Health Association, and we just took a stance similar to what you're saying, that you don't need the addiction model necessarily to get help and, improve your life. And of course, that's been received with some pushback for sure. I understand that, but my concern is the amount of sex addiction treatment centers that are just continuing to pop up in like I say, these more conservative areas of our country. And to your point, there's a lot of money spent on these types of treatments. It's usually not covered by insurance, and addiction in of itself is a label that seems to stay with people for the rest of their lives. Once an addict, always an addict type of phenomenon, and I don't know how that can be healthy to have that type of label associated with your sexuality as you're trying to progress and have a healthy relationship with your spouse or your partner.
Sure. Some people have argued not just with sex addiction, but with diagnoses in general, that sometimes labels can be ameliorative, right? That being able to say, oh, I get it, I am bipolar, I have bipolar disorder, that helps me understand why I'm interacting with people in the way that I am and can help me improve my behavior. But the key there is the label has to be accurate. I think that's the trouble here is, we assume, oh, well, if we just give people the right term, that they'll feel better just because they have a label. But in this case, the label is inaccurate. And that's not going to be helpful. It's going to be harmful, as the data we're seeing. So, absolutely, I think it's there's tremendous risk in putting a label that's supposed to be lifelong on someone, but it sure does benefit the therapist financially to do that.
Yeah, which is an ethical concern of itself. Correct. Okay, well, I have gone through my very expansive list, and I know your time is very valuable, but I want to just open up the space for you to share anything that you feel I haven't covered or that you wanted to make sure you were able to cover on an interview such as this.
Sure, I think you've touched on it a little bit, but one thing I always like to be sure is clear is many times when people see us attacking the addiction model, and by attacking I mean calling out that some of the predictions are inconsistent and that this really looks unlike any other substance or behavioral addiction. As they say, that's terrible. You don't want people to get help, and you're so mean. And I want to be clear that is not at all our intention. So if sexual behaviors, if viewing erotica is not an addiction, it could be that it's just a values conflict, and that's all that's happening. That's one thing we're investigating, and others are investigating. It could also be that compulsivity better describes the type of sexual behaviors. It could be that it's impulsivity. I think that's unlikely, but an impulsivity model is possible. A high sex drive model is possible. Maybe these are people who just have unusually high sex drive and need a better way of managing it. So, I just want to make clear that it's not an attack to say that people don't deserve help or that there might not be something else wrong. So that saying it's not an addiction doesn't mean any of those things. That it's a scientific argument that we're making, that the addiction model just doesn't fit from that perspective. And it's important because the model determines the treatment. So we want to be sure that we have the best model available, that we have chosen accurately, because that will guide what it is we need to do with patients to best help them. So I think it's a much more compassionate approach that we're taking, although I know it's not often seen that way, and that we want to understand the best way to help someone who's reporting these types of issues. And it may be that that is just a social conflict with existing values, and if that's the case, then there's an app for that, right? I mean, there are treatment approaches that deal with those kinds of issues, probably more psychoeducational. If it looks like it's more high drive, we're working on methods to help with that particular approach. There's not a lot to help with it yet, but we're working on it. So these models are more than just words. I think it is important what type of word you use, but using a different word doesn't mean they don't deserve help. And just want to be sure that's a piece of it.
Yeah, thank you. Do you mind, just for the benefit of the audience, to explain the difference between compulsivity, impulsivity, and addiction? I think those words get very mixed up very often in the public sphere.
Sure. Probably the easiest way is to think about obsessive compulsive disorder when you talk about compulsivity as a model. So, in OCD, if we take one of the most common forms, that is a contamination fear. So these are people that wash their hands a lot, and when they're out and about, they think about what they're touching, what they're being exposed to quite a lot, and their thoughts are so excessive, that they become distracting. It can become difficult to interact with people because you're worried about what they touched and whether you should shake their hands and all these types of things. And then that you can compulsively engage in a behavior that's going to reduce then that fear. So you can wash your hands, or you can consistently wear gloves, or any of these number of interventions. So a compulsivity model is focusing of sexual behaviors would focus more on those behaviors being some kind of a compulsive response to anxiety. So it could be any number. I'm trying to think of like a clearest example here, but say, you're very worried that people are going to see you sweat at work, that you're kind of a phony and you're going to be found out and your work's not up to snuff and people are going to see straight through you, and somehow like masturbating helps discharge that anxiety, that the act of being sexually aroused or the orgasm, who knows what piece it is, but that some aspect of that you find helpful in discharging or reducing that anxiety, and so you do it repeatedly to kind of deal with this very high anxiety over time. You don't need to be abstinent in a compulsivity treatment, whereas in addiction treatments, abstinence is usually the first step. These are important distinctions because, for example, I used to work as a couples therapist. I'm a licensed psychologist myself. And it was a huge problem to have people come in where one of the couples had this sex addiction label, and I would love if they would start to become intimate with each other again. And the other partner often would love that, but they're prohibited. And they have some arbitrary length of time set determined by no science that claims they need to be completely abstinent of sexual stimulation in general. That was very harmful to their couples treatment. So, whether it's compulsivity or an addiction model can affect treatment in that type of way. That is, whether you believe there needs to be an abstinent period or not. OCD we also see, I think, as more treatable. We have good data showing neuro changes over time with talk therapy alone that strongly support some of those interventions. So we could then be using those OCD treatments more with the sexual behaviors, but we don't currently do it because there's so much panic and talk around the addiction model. Impulsivity is more something, if it was impulsivity, it would look like you're walking down the street on your way to go get dinner, and all of a sudden you have to duck into an internet cafe to masturbate immediately. So those are types of impulsive behaviors where you feel the need to act on them immediately, somewhat out of the blue. And to me, the erotica viewing behaviors just don't look impulsive. They're generally planned. They're in a controlled setting, at the same computer with the same door shut over time. They look a lot more habitual and possibly more compulsive than they do impulsive to me. But there are neurological tests that have actually differentiated compulsive and impulsive behaviors, and we have never conducted those on people who claim to have porn problems. So there are certainly things we could do, tests we could do to differentiate them, to better understand them, but those haven't been done. And I like that there's most scientists these days refer to sexual compulsivity, so I think that's overwhelmingly the more popular model scientifically right now, although we're still sorting out whether it's the best.
Yeah, I also see another model being the out-of-control behavior model by...
Doug Harvey-Braun?
Yes, that seems to also be trying to use different language. Seems to be a lot of different language out there that's trying to be offering other possibilities other than the addiction model.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the predictions that their model's making, so if it's strictly clinical at this time, that may be why it just hasn't gotten into the research literature yet. And so in any case, anytime we see a new model, the first question is, what predictions is it making that's unique? How can we differentiate it from the others, and what tests do we need to do to be able to determine if that's been falsified or not? So I'm broadly familiar with that their model exists, but it's not totally clear to me how to differentiate it from some of these better established models so far. But absolutely, we'll be watching for it and trying to listen for ways that we can test their model as well.
Great. Well, I can't thank you enough for the time you've spent. This has been very, very informative and just wonderful to hear you speak about so many of these issues that just get thrown around on a daily basis. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
I appreciate the time to chat. It's great.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, You can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the now. We can always go to the homeland of the heart. "10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki shade so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. To the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki shade